Hello and welcome to the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Emily Rutherford-Liska. I'm Executive Director of the Jacksonville Historical Society. We have a fun show for you because the show really is such a wonderful reflection of the holidays. We're going to talk about one of the best Christmas gifts, December gifts ever to the city of Jacksonville, a gift we got 20 years ago and are celebrating that 20th anniversary now. And we're also going to talk about one of Jacksonville's most beloved holiday events, the Gingerbread Extravaganza. But first, to talk about one of the greatest gifts the city of Jacksonville has ever received is the godfather of Jacksonville history, my guest, Wayne Wood. Hello, Wayne.
Well, thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind words.
And you are the creator of that gift. That gift, in fact, was given as of December 7th, 1989, and it was this wonderful book, Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage. You are the author of that book, and it does celebrate its 20th anniversary in December. So,
well, thank you, Emily. The book itself started as a project of the Jacksonville Historical and Cultural Commission that was appointed by the mayor back in the 70s, and I got appointed to that commission about 1975. And we decided that Jacksonville was getting second shrift as far as its historic architecture, being sandwiched between St. Augustine and Savannah, two of the better known southern cities for their architecture. So we decided to write a pamphlet. And about that time we changed the name of the Jacksonville Historical and Cultural Conservation Commission, because nobody could say it,
yeah,
to the Jacksonville Historic Landmarks Commission. And we set out to write a pamphlet about 1976. And it got bigger and bigger as we researched Jacksonville history until it became a 424-page book.
13 years later.
Well, actually way later than that, because people would always ask me, when is the book ready? Once they heard I was writing a book, and I said, yes, it'll be ready for Christmas. I just forgot to tell them it was going to be 12 years later.
and indeed it was, but what a gift, Wayne. What a gift.
Well, thank you. And you've been very kind to say that I'm the author of it. I was probably the lead author, but hundreds of people literally worked on this book, as we'll talk about in just a moment. In fact, let's take a look at Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, the book, and just give your viewers a little history behind the history book.
Perfect.
The cover of the book was designed by Linda Mack, who is probably Jacksonville's greatest architectural artist, and she unfortunately passed away shortly after the book was published, but she was one of Jacksonville's treasures, and she did many of the illustrations that are in the book.
And we're going to pause for a minute. Now, here we are.
Here's a beautiful rendering she did of Clutho Apartments on Main Street. But our team was quite talented. Steve Toole was working for the Historic Landmarks Commission at the time and did much of the research for the book, and then he went on to other things, and Joel McKeeshan came along and became director of the Landmarks Commission, which he still is to this day. We had two very talented photographers, Judy Davis and David Vitas, who took literally thousands of archival quality photographs that still remain, picturing Jacksonville as it was back in the 1970s and 80s, and they became the core illustrations for this book, along with many of Linda Mack's drawings. But what we noticed as we went through this process, that Jacksonville did not deserve its short shrift in architectural historical circles, because there were hundreds of buildings in Jacksonville that were very imaginative and amazing architecture, and the more we got into it, the more we realized that all of these wonderful buildings, architectural styles, many of them going back well over 100 years, deserved being recognized. But the trouble was there was no previous research to speak of on these buildings. We did not know who the architects were, when they were built. We didn't really even know what style they were. So we studied and looked and found buildings that were of every imaginable style, from Second Empire to Victorian to Colonial Revival to who knows what it was. Beautiful Mediterranean Revival homes. We have literally palaces in Avondale and Ortega. We have wonderful turn-of-the-century houses in Springfield and San Marco, Mediterranean Revival styles, Victorian styles, and buildings that would be a credit to any city throughout the world, including Art Deco. And even here depicted is the oldest house we discovered in our process, built way before 1850, probably the oldest house in Duval County that is still inhabited, over near Empire Point.
By Mike Langton, in fact.
But
yes.
Jacksonville also has treasures such as its cadre of prairie-style buildings. Most people are surprised to hear that we have so much architecture from the prairie style of architecture, which originated out in the Midwest. But Henry Clutho came to Jacksonville and built many of these buildings that have this very avant-garde style that dates back to the early part of the century. And we even have shingle-style buildings here. So connected with all of these styles, we set out to write a book and explain Jacksonville's architecture not only to ourselves but to the citizens and actually to the world, that Jacksonville has this wonderful collection of architectural styles and buildings that are worthy of any city, and so this book celebrated that. In addition to that, we wanted to learn more about the architects who designed them, so the book contains a history of the architects, and this was a lot of research because most of these architects were barely known, and now we can see their just place in the history of our city and building it. The book's laid out in sections by neighborhood, so that the beginning of each section has a description of the history of that neighborhood, and then goes on to have a map showing how to go through the neighborhood and see these buildings. We intentionally put it in order so it's like a walking and driving tour, so that as you flip through the book you can go from one building to the next without having to backtrack in your tour around the city. And we talked about the various landmark buildings and the research that we turned up just fascinated us with all these stories that we got. And again, we did hundreds of interviews of citizens of Jacksonville, of people who had lived here for a long, long time and knew these stories, but also it required digging in archives and museums all over the country to get the information about buildings that are the heart of our city. And we talked about 30 different neighborhoods that had historic buildings in them, and these buildings each has their story, and I fashioned the text as if my father, who knew nothing about architecture, was standing in front of a building, and he would ask me the question, well, why is this building important? And then I would tell him. And it certainly is a good entree into understanding Jacksonville's architecture for the novice, but also it's held up very well as a book that scholars have referred to and has stood the test of time. And as we look for other parts of the book, we did a section on buildings for the future, because just as buildings are historic today, the general criteria for the National Register of Historic Places is 50 years. Well, some of those buildings that were considered very modern buildings when we started this book are now actually eligible for the National Register, and we need to have a new appreciation for these modern buildings that will truly be our landmarks for the future. A sad part of the book was when we talked about buildings that had been lost. And so many of Jacksonville's great buildings that were built after the Great Fire of 1901 have been torn down. In fact, the majority of downtown was rebuilt after the fire, and the vast majority of those buildings have now gone. And the ones we have left are all the more precious because of that. Well, the book came out on December the 7th, 1989, and we had no idea if people would receive it or not. Well, Emily, the book sold out in 3 weeks. It was just phenomenal.
That's amazing.
And we had it out in time for Christmas, and so many people were disappointed. It took a while to get the second edition out, and it came out about a year later. And after the second edition came out, it was on the bestseller list in Jacksonville for over a year, and it was number one, the number one selling book in the city of Jacksonville, according to the Times Union book list, for over 24 weeks. Which we thought was pretty amazing.
Well, we're going to come back to Seth for just a minute here and talk about that, because there is no history lover who I know who lives in the city of Jacksonville who does not have this book. And if they don't, they better run to get it, because it is just amazing. And you're right, it's just this armchair visit with your city through its wonderful buildings. And the great stories. I mean, there's the story of the gorilla that lived on top of the Florida Life building, if I'm correct. And let's see, the story of Henry Clutho driving through a hurricane to get downtown to check on his very tall, narrow Bisbee building, I think it was.
That's right. First skyscraper in Florida. And we were concerned, too, that this not just be a catalog like the Sears Roebuck catalog of buildings, but it had the story of the people as well as the designers of the building. Architecture is the most public form of art, in that we all share it collectively as a city, and if one building is torn down, it affects all of us because it's part of our heritage. And so we wanted people to not only understand the buildings, but also perhaps raise the awareness so that we could protect these buildings before some of the more wonderful ones could be demolished. In fact, that was the case as I was driving out to take a photograph of this building you see on the screen now.
So we're going to go back to the screen and look at some more buildings. Oh my goodness.
It's part of our survey.
Yeah.
We went out to take a photograph of this building, and it was being demolished the very day I was going to document it for the Jacksonville's architectural heritage. By the time we got the book finished, from 1976 to 1989, over 20% of the buildings had been torn down. And even since the book has been published, dozens and dozens of Jacksonville's great landmarks have been torn down. So our work is never done. Part of the message of Jacksonville's architectural heritage is how fragile our urban and built environment is, and how careful we must proceed to understand it, to protect it, to appreciate it, and to pass it on to generations yet unborn.
What dramatic photos.
And such great old buildings. The downtown skyline was silhouetted by these great hotels such as the Mason, or later the Mayflower, the Seminole Hotel, the George Washington Hotel, and the great Hurd Building, which was the tallest skyscraper in Florida at one time. And these buildings have been erased from our skyline, the signature buildings of Jacksonville. Other very famous buildings like these three on the corner of Forsyth and Laura Street, which still exists. We call them the Laura Street Trio because it's such a wonderful grouping of historic architecture. These buildings have been vacant for over 10 years and are very vulnerable and probably the most endangered species in our Jacksonville architectural heritage today. But there have been victories. There are other buildings that have been saved by a thread, and we're hanging on to the Panama Park School, designed by Clutho, shown here, was the building depicted on the cover of the book. And it's also very vulnerable. It closed as a public school last year, and we're hoping that the new owners can restore it. But then there are buildings like the Clutho Apartments on Main Street that have been wonderfully restored and are world-class landmark buildings that are internationally famous even as we speak. And the old Black Masonic Temple on Broad Street, a wonderful building that's been restored. And the Florida Theater, what a great save that was. And the St. James Building, formerly a department store, is now our city hall, one of the most beautiful city halls in America. So we're lucky to have preserved so many buildings, and the Historical Society, the Jacksonville Historical Society, has played a lead role in saving several of our most important buildings, including Old St. Andrew's Church, which is on the National Register and dates back to 1888, as well as the Merrill House next door, which was built some 10 years earlier and is truly one of the great house museums in the United States. I've been all over the country visiting old buildings, and what the Historical Society has done for that building is just nothing short of magical.
Thank you, Wayne.
It is a treasure, and hopefully as people come to the Gingerbread Spectacular, they'll be able to take a tour of the Merrill House, which is just, if you've not seen it, you must see it, and if you've seen it, you must see it again.
Yeah, two great Christmas delights, that's true.
2 blocks away is another building that is very much part of Jacksonville history that goes back to 1878, Old St. Luke's Hospital, which was the first public hospital in the state of Florida, built in 1878 by a very famous architect named George Hoover. And 10 years later, a wing was added onto the building, so it was in this configuration. Back in 1975, this building was being torn down, and a group got together called the Bucks for Bricks campaign, and as the wing that you see on the side of the building was being torn down, we sold those bricks as a fundraiser and restored it, were able to save it and restore it to its original configuration. And this building has been owned by the Arthritis Foundation for a long time, and now the Jacksonville Historical Society is in the process of acquiring that building to make it a historical center, as well as a place for our archives and a place where nonprofit groups can come and have their research center. You see this aerial view next to the hospital is the old Casket Factory that was built many, many years later. But this is one of the things that make this building work so well for us, because it has thousands of square feet right next to the old St. Luke's Hospital that will allow us to have huge displays, research facilities. Here you see an interior shot of it with those big 18-foot ceilings, and that space will allow us to really have a collection of 4 great old buildings within a 2-block area that will become the Jacksonville History Center. So as we look out at our city today and see its skyline and the beautiful modern buildings, certainly it's my theory that these old buildings fit very well with the modern Jacksonville and become part of the tapestry that is our city. And as we look off into the landmarks of the future, that we can pass on buildings that are worthy of our culture and tell the story of Jacksonville in no better way that I know of.
Well, I know no better way to learn the story of the city's history than through this wonderful book, Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, and it's a great time to showcase its 20th anniversary. I want to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful not only book but presentation today for the public, because anyone who just saw all those photographs and visuals of Jacksonville, Florida, has to be proud of their city. Now we all have to be committed to saving that history that's there through our wonderful, wonderful buildings that are unique to Jacksonville and so important. So thank you for bringing that message to us, Wayne.
Well, thank you, Emily. It's my pleasure, and I hope your viewers, if they don't have the book, will buy one. All the bookstores have them. The Jacksonville Historical Society has them for sale. They're on sale at my office pretty much everywhere you go, and it has over 1,000 pictures in it. Over 600 buildings are featured, and it is the perfect holiday gift. Hint,
how many printings have you had now?
This book has gone through 6 printings.
Oh, wow.
Someone has said that it's probably on more coffee tables than any other book in Florida, and I know it's sold well over 20,000 copies. One of the bestsellers for the University Press of Florida, that is the publisher for the book.
I want to thank you again for being here, and you're always a very welcome guest and such a treat. Thank you, Wayne Wood, author of Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, and that's your fun job as well. Your other fun job is you are a local
An optometrist. Well, that's one of my many hats.
One of your many.
My latest fun job is I'm one of the curators of the Riverside Arts Market, our Saturday art market under the Fuller Warren Bridge in Riverside, and that's part of our preservation efforts to keep the neighborhood strong and have people active and enjoying their environment of the neighborhood.
And you're actually the person bringing that wonderful entertainment each week to that market.
I have a lot of fun doing that.
And you have brought some amazing people to Jacksonville.
Well,
thank you for all you've done for our city, Dr. Wood. And I want everybody to stay with us because I think we're here. I want everybody to stay with us because we are going to showcase some of Jacksonville's most treasured buildings in a very unique way. Believe it or not, gingerbread buildings that showcase our historic treasures right here in our city. Coming up next on the Jacksonville History Show. Stay with us.